Hey, so I'm recording this video on right after Thanksgiving, and um, it's also the very end of Native American Heritage Month. And I thought that I would look through my bookcase in my home library. These are mostly books that were mine when I was a kid, and see if there were any sort of classics that I could share with you. And I got thinking about some of the books that I read when I was a kid, when I was your age, and two of them come to mind that are actually kind of controversial now. One, Little House on the Prairie, and Island of the Blue Dolphins. Both of them controversial because of the sort of very inaccurate ways that they portray Native American people, Indigenous people. So, like, I think that even when I was a kid, I knew when I read Little House on the Prairie and all of those books that the way that they portray Indians is very racist. It's very, you know, they basically portray them as dangerous savages. And even though at the time when the books were written, or when the story takes place, was a time when settlers were really in a lot of conflict with Native Americans. It doesn't mean that we really want people going around thinking that that's the way we should treat them. So, and then Island of the Blue Dolphins is a book about a Native American woman who lives, it's actually based on a true story, lives on an island in the Pacific Ocean, and gets left behind by her people and has to survive for a long period of time by herself. And the problem with Island of the Blue Dolphins is that Scott Odell, who wrote the book, was not an Indigenous person himself, and a lot of the things that he did do a lot of research when he wrote the book, but a lot of the depictions are very are not accurate and not necessarily the truth. And the concern with this one is also that people will, because Karana in the book lives in a very primitive way. The concern about either of these books is that people will, think that Native American Indigenous people are primitive or in some way um, either inferior or warlike or dangerous or any of those stereotypes that are inaccurate. So, I'm not going to read you either of these books today, but I was thinking about, like, what was it about these books that I really liked? Because really that part of it I didn't think about that when I was a kid. I knew it was, I knew in Little House on the Prairie, the way they talked about Indigenous people was wrong. And I knew that that was inaccurate. But what was it I liked about these books? And what I liked about these books was the survival aspect. The fact that there was a lot in these books about what people had to do to live off the land and survive in a either by themselves or in without very many people around. And I just found that really fascinating. So that made me pick up this book, which is called My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, which was really just a longtime favorite of mine. My brother loved it too, and he wasn't really much of a reader, but he loved this book too. And it is probably the quintessential survival book. And so then I thought about, like, why is it that I love these survival stories? And I think it's because, they actually talk about it the author talks about it in the preface of this book, which I'm not going to read to you because I want to read you the meat of the story. But um, every kid, I think, loves that idea of, like, running away and living by themselves with no grown-ups to tell them what to do. And a lot of kids do try running away, right? Like, you try it when you're a little kid and you come back in like 15 minutes or an hour or whatever it is. Because the reality is you're not really going to live by yourself when you're a little kid. But that idea of being independent is really fascinating. So, My Side of the Mountain is a story it's an adventure story of a kid. It's a made up story. I just want to say this. This is not a true story. It's a story of a kid who goes off by himself and builds a house and lives on the land all by himself. So I'm going to read you a little bit of My Side of the Mountain. And this one really does, I think, hold up. I mean, this was written in, let me find the copyright date, which I can find on this Verso page. The copyright date for this is 1959, but yet it's still, I've given it to lots of kids to read, and most people really, really still like this book. So my side of the mountain, in which I hole up in a snowstorm. I'm on my mountain in a tree home that people have passed without ever knowing that I'm here. The house is a hemlock tree 6 feet in diameter and must be as old as the mountain itself. I came upon it last summer and dug and burned it out until I made a snug cave in the tree that I now call home. My bed is on the right as you enter and is made of ash slats and covered with deerskin. On the left is a small fireplace about knee high. It is of clay and stones. It has a chimney that leads the smoke out through a knothole. I chipped out 3 other knotholes to let fresh air in. The air coming in is bitter cold. It must be below zero outside, and yet I can sit here inside my tree and write with bare hands. The fire is small, too. It doesn't take much fire to warm this tree room. It's the 4th of December, I think. It may be the 5th. I'm not sure because I have not recently counted the notches on the aspen pole that is my calendar. I have been just too busy gathering nuts and berries, smoking venison, fish, and small game to keep up with the exact date. The lamp I am writing by is deer fat poured into a turtle shell with a strip of my old city trousers for a wick. It snowed all day yesterday and today. I've not been outside since the storm began, and I'm bored for the first time since I ran away from home 8 months ago to live on the land. I'm well and healthy. The food is good. Sometimes I eat turtle soup, and I know how to make acorn pancakes. I keep my supplies on the wall of the treehouse in wooden pockets that I chopped myself. Every time that I have looked at those pockets during the last 2 days, I've felt just like a squirrel, which reminds me, I didn't see a squirrel one whole day before that storm began. I guess they're holed up and eating their stored nuts, too. I wonder if the Baron, that's the wild weasel who lives behind the big boulder to the north of my tree, is also denned up. Well, anyway, I think the storm is dying down because the tree is not crying so much. When the wind really blows, the whole tree moans right down to the roots, which is where I am. Tomorrow, I hope the Baron and I can tunnel out into the sunlight. I wonder if I should dig the snow, but that would mean I would have to put it somewhere, and the only place to put it is in my nice snug tree. Maybe I can pack it with my hands as I go. I've always dug into the snow from the top, never up from under. The Baron must dig up from under the snow. I wonder where he puts what he digs. Well, I guess I'll know in the morning. When I wrote that last winter, I was scared and thought maybe I'd never get out of my tree. I'd been scared for 2 days, ever since the first blizzard hit the Catskill Mountains. When I came up to the sunlight, which I did by simply poking my head into the soft snow and standing up, I laughed at my dark fears. Everything was white, clean, shining, and beautiful. The sky was blue, blue, blue. The hemlock grove was laced with snow. The meadow was smooth and white, and the gorge was sparkling with ice. It was so beautiful and peaceful that I laughed out loud. I guess I laughed because my first snowstorm was over and had not been so terrible after all. Then I shouted, "I did it!" My voice never got very far. It was hushed by the tons of snow. I looked for signs from the Baron Weasel. His footsteps were all over the boulder, also slides where he had played. He must have been up for hours, enjoying the new snow. Inspired by his fun, I poked my head into my tree and whistled. Frightful, my trained falcon flew into my fist, and we jumped and slid down the mountain, making big holes and trenches as we went. It was good to be whistling and carefree again, because I was sure scared by the coming of that storm. I had been working since May, learning how to make a fire with flint and steel, finding what plants I could eat, how to trap animals and catch fish. All this so that when the curtain of blizzard struck the Catskills, I could crawl inside my tree and be comfortably warm and have plenty to eat. During the summer and fall, I had thought about the coming of winter. However, on that 3rd day of December, when the sky blackened, the temperature dropped, and the first flakes swirled around me, I must admit that I wanted to run back to New York. Even the first night that I spent out in the woods, when I couldn't get the fire started, was not as frightening as the snowstorm that gathered behind the gorge and mushroomed up over my mountain. I was smoking 3 trout. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was busy keeping the flames low so they would not leap up and burn the fish. As I worked, it occurred to me that it was awfully dark for that hour of the morning. Frightful was leashed to her tree stub. She seemed restless and pulled at her tethers. Then I realized that the forest was dead quiet. Even the woodpeckers that had been tapping around me all morning were silent. The squirrels were nowhere to be seen. The juncos and chickadees and nuthatches were all gone. I looked to see that the Baron Weasel looked to see what the Baron Weasel was doing. He was not around. I looked up. From my tree you could see the gorge beyond the meadow. White water pours between the black, wet boulders and cascades into the valley below. The water that day was as dark as the rocks. Only the sound told me it was still falling. Above the darkness stood another darkness, the clouds of winter, black and fearsome. They looked as wild as the winds that were bringing them. I grew sick with fright. I knew I had enough food. I knew everything was going to be perfectly all right, but knowing that didn't help. I was scared. I stamped out the fire and pocketed the fish. I tried to whistle for Frightful, but couldn't purse my shaking lips tight enough to get out anything but so I grabbed her by the hide straps that are attached to her legs, and we dove through the deerskin door into my room in the tree. I put Frightful on the bedpost and curled up in a ball on the bed. I thought about New York and the noise and the lights and how a snowstorm always seemed very friendly there. I thought about our apartment, too. At that moment, it seemed bright and lighted and warm. I had to keep saying to myself, there were 11 of us in it. Dad, mother, 4 sisters, 4 brothers, and me. And not one of us liked it, except perhaps little Nina, who was too young to know. Dad didn't like it even a little bit. He'd been a sailor once, but when I was born, he gave up the sea and worked on the docks in New York. Dad didn't like the land. He liked the sea, wet and big and endless. Sometimes he would tell me about great-grandfather Gribley, who owned land in the Catskill Mountains and felled the trees and built a home and plowed the land, only to discover that he wanted to be a sailor. The farm failed, and great-grandfather Gribley went to sea. As I lay with my face buried in the sweet, greasy smell of my deerskin, I could hear Dad's voice saying, "That land is still in the family's name. Somewhere in the Catskills is an old beach with the name Gribley carved in it. It marks the northern boundary of Gribley's Folly. The land is no place for a Gribley." "The land is no place for a Gribley," I said. "The land is no place for a Gribley, and here I am, 300 feet from the beach with Gribley carved on it." I fell asleep at that point, and when I woke, I was hungry. I cracked some walnuts, got down the acorn flour that I'd pounded, with a bit of ash to remove the bite, reached out the door for a little snow, and stirred up some acorn pancakes. I cooked them on top of a tin can, and as I ate them, smothered with blueberry jam, I knew that the land was just the place for a Gribley. So that's the beginning of my side of the mountain. If you are interested in survival kind of running away stories, then this one might be fun for you. And I'm definitely not trying to say that you can't or shouldn't read books like this that are classics too, but just realize that a lot of classics, and we have that whole section in the library, the whole shelf of classics, realize that those books are, they were written a while ago and they have some very outdated stereotypes in them that were wrong when they were written, and they're still wrong. And as long as you take that into account when you're reading them and move on from there, then I hope you enjoy them. Have a great time reading.